who are you? Do you know who you are? Because I'm literally not who I say I am. I'm not Albert Frantz. Well, I am and I'm not. I'm a bit confused. I'm confused because I've carried a fake ID all my life and didn't even know it. My parents never even met. There are at least 1 million other people out there like me, and one of them might even be you. And you might not even know it. Yet I believe you deserve to know. I'm talking about the most fundamental thing about being human, and that is identity. Who are we? The topic of identity has been thrust into the national spotlight this year. We've had 2 prominent cases here in the United States, Bruce/Caitlyn Jenner, involving gender identity, and Rachel Dolezal, involving racial identity. These cases sparked national debates about who we are on the inside versus the outside, who we are to ourselves and who we appear to be to others. Now, I believe all of us have a fundamental right to know and to be who we are. I'm going to talk about ethical and legal issues surrounding identity. Identity is an intensely emotional issue for billions of us. It's the most deeply personal thing in the world. I grew up in a multiracial family. My 3 siblings were all adopted from Asia, my 2 brothers from Vietnam during the war. Once they visited me in college, and after they left, a buddy of mine said, do they know they're adopted? Now, my sister was adopted from South Korea, and she's about this tall, and, well, a little more. And when I visit, we have this routine. She introduces me to her friends by saying, "This is my twin brother, Albert." And they give us this look, and I say, "Well, obviously, we're not identical twins." And then they all say, "So that means you're fraternal twins?" And we nod our heads, and everybody believes us. Now, I always considered myself a child of technology. I was part of the first personal computer generation. But I had no idea that I am literally a child of technology, of reproductive technology, as it turns out. I learned from very close family friends later in life that I'm the product of artificial insemination. Nowadays, the technical term is third-party reproduction or assisted reproduction, and it's not too big a deal, especially here in California. This is the capital. But believe me, when you've been lied to your whole life about who you are, it's kind of hard to take lightly. Let's just say I know what an identity crisis is. So the question now in everybody's mind is, so what's it like being the product of asexual reproduction? Well, for starters, the ickiest thought for many people is the thought of their parents having sex. Now, my parents really never have had sex. But on a serious note, you look in the mirror and you wonder who's looking back. You can't help but wonder who the other half of you is. Now, let me say, at this point, this is in no way a criticism of the parents who raised me and whom I love and who love me. I understand the pressure that they were under, and I want to communicate that as an important idea here, that families that are constructed in alternative ways, let's say, we have to appreciate the complexity of them. I want to talk a little bit about ethics, about the ethics of the fertility industry. Let's just say this is an industry that doesn't exactly have a clean track record when it comes to ethical practices. It is an industry, and like all industries, it is about the money, and the industry will do anything it can to protect its profits. The industry sometimes ends up lying to its customers or to its patients. They lie, for example, about the number of children per donor. Sometimes women will ask, well, how many children can my sperm donor be expected to have? And they might say, oh, it might be 8 or 10, maybe a dozen. And the reality sometimes is in the hundreds. There are guidelines by independent organizations, such as the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, but there's almost no legal regulation here in the United States and also in many other countries throughout the world. There are no reporting requirements. Nobody knows how many donor-conceived persons there are because nobody is keeping track. Welcome to the brave new world. Everybody's heard of this. Many of you have read this novel written in 1931 by Aldous Huxley. And in the novel, one of the main points is that Huxley foreshadowed reproductive technology. In it, he wrote of a fictional process called Bokanovsky's process. And I quote, "One egg, one embryo, one adult, normality. But a Bokanovskified egg will bud, will proliferate, will divide from 8 to 96 buds, and every bud will grow into a perfectly formed embryo, and every embryo into a full-sized adult, making 96 human beings grow where only one grew before. Progress." And this is effectively what we're doing now in the fertility industry. There was a study in Canada that concluded not too long ago that a donor-conceived person can expect to have anywhere between 100 and 625 siblings or half-siblings, whatever you want to call them. 600 something, obviously that's an extreme case, but I think 100 is also extreme. Another major ethical issue of sperm or egg donation is eugenics. Eugenics is the idea that we can improve the gene pool through selective breeding. And this week's TED Talk of the Week, just got in my email the other day, is all about eugenics. It's about the new ability to edit our DNA that we could use now not just for curing diseases, but also for desirable traits. We can make designer babies. Where do we draw the line? And I think we have to realize that sperm and egg donation is inherently a eugenic process. The parent of your child is literally picked out of a catalog. Should the mother or father of your child be an Ivy League grad, a sports star, a model? And all of these and more are for sale. Eugenics is certainly an incredibly dangerous ideology that is most associated with the Nazis. They thought that humanity would be better if only they could eliminate the Jews and other populations. But eugenics didn't actually originate there. I discovered that it actually goes back 2,500 years, way back to Socrates and Plato. Here's a quote from Plato's Republic in the voice of Socrates, Plato's teacher. "All these women should be shared among all the men." He was talking about breeding the warrior classes. "And no individual woman and man should live together, and the children too should be shared, with no parent knowing its own offspring, and no child its parent." Now, who am I to disagree with arguably the wisest person who's ever lived? But this is one of those rare occasions when I think it's okay to disagree with Socrates. There are also psychological issues that we have to understand and respect. And one of them is that anonymity deprives us from knowing who we really are, a major significant part of us. One of my dearest friends, Laurie, was adopted by very loving parents. She had a very happy childhood, and yet a close friend of hers once asked her why she and her husband didn't have children. And Laurie answered, "You don't understand. I fell from the sky." And if you've never had to experience this feeling of groundlessness, it's pretty impossible to describe what it really is. But the psychological and emotional effect that it has on many of us should never be taken for granted. Now, as fate would have it, quite serendipitously, Laurie's sister, also a friend of mine, Jean McEwen, happens to be a director at the National Human Genome Research Institute. She's in charge of the Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications Research Program. And this means that in the entire United States, Jean is the person most responsible for the legal and ethical issues that I'm talking about today. Jean encouraged me to get my DNA tested. And very nervously, I did exactly that just this year. I waited a long time for the results, and when they came back, I discovered I had thousands of relatives, mostly distant relatives, obviously, that I didn't know about, and almost all of them are Jewish, it turns out. I discovered, you can do this now with DNA testing, that on my biological father's side, I'm fully Ashkenazi Jewish, plus there are several segments of DNA on my mother's side that surprised us. At least it explains why I've always felt like I could filter fish out of water. I wasn't too surprised. I've been asked in my life, relatively often, hey, are you Jewish? But nobody ever asked me, hey, are you black? Now, it turns out, by the way, that Jean, this genetics expert, she was also adopted. She also took a DNA test. She also discovered that she's half Jewish. So now we have a new nickname for her, June. Anyway, if you do decide to take a DNA test, I thought a DNA test was a DNA test, and it's nothing of the sort. It's actually pretty complicated, way over my head. I'm still coming to know all the terms or the fraction of them. You could get your mitochondrial DNA tested, that's your mother's line. Men can have their Y DNA tested, and for the rest of your chromosomes, you can get your autosomal DNA tested, which gives you the most relatives, the most matches in the database, actually. So which one did I take? I started with the autosomal test because it's the cheapest and I'm Jewish. So my next step then is to get my Y DNA tested because it's associated with last names. And until I find out my Jewish last name, I'm not Goldman, I'm not Silverman, I'm Iron Man. So what does it mean now to be 40 years old and suddenly discover you're Jewish? Now, it might mean something very different if I were living here, but I happen to live in Hitler's country of Austria, and I can literally walk to the nearest concentration camp. If I lived in my adopted city of Vienna just 2 generations ago, my grandparents' generation, the Nazi authorities would have come knocking on my door one day, and we know the rest. It suddenly made my city's dark past that much more real and emotional to me. Now, I'm going to be trying to figure out what this all means for years to come, but I am certain of one thing. Part of our identity rights is the right to our own ethnic and cultural heritage. Now, I believe we need some changes, some important changes in this industry, and they need to be legal changes. One is we absolutely have to limit the number of children per donor. Practically speaking, no man could have hundreds of children naturally, and I don't think anyone really should by artificial means either. Also, we have to end anonymity for donor-conceived people and adoptees. We have a right to know our origins. This is a basic human right, I believe. Some countries have already recognized this right. The UK, Germany, Austria, some countries in Europe, there are other ones, a few, but not that many. I believe also that we need to put all the names on the birth certificates. We can't erase the names of biological parents in the cases of donor-conceived people and adoptees. I think we need to honor both nurture and nature. Now, the United Nations has a Convention on the Rights of the Child, which they drafted in 1989. And in it, part of it, I'm just going to quote in part, one article states that the child shall have the right from birth to know and be cared for by his or her parents. The next article says, states parties undertake to respect the right of the child to preserve his or her identity, including family relations, as recognized by law without unlawful interference. Now, if you think about it, this is actually contradictory. Even though the UN recognizes identity rights for children, the law in many countries, including here in the US, allows biological parents to be erased from birth certificates and the documents sealed. This must change. Also, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is signed by 196 countries. and it's been ratified by 192 out of 193 UN members. And the one country that has yet to ratify it is the United States. Now, in conclusion, the philosopher Immanuel Kant recognizes the paradox of bringing people into this world. Children can't decide whether or not they want to be born. There are a lot of things that do need to be decided for us, but who we are is not one of them. And I think it's unbelievably unethical to manufacture people and tell them they're someone else. Beyond the basic right to life and the right not to be enslaved, I cannot think of a more fundamental human right than the right to our own identity. Our identity should not literally be a corporate or a state secret. It must be considered our birthright. I think that is an idea worth spreading.